All right. Okay, I think we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Weathers here with Your Vitality Project with my good friend, Doug Prater, joining us. Thank you, Doug, for coming tonight.
Hi, Dr. Bob. Glad to see you. Good to be here.
Pleased to be with you too, my friend. Our topic tonight is a theme that we've been looking at for the last few days and we'll be looking at over the next few weeks. There's a way that we've been looking at it throughout all of our posts, but there's more of a focus right now, and I'm calling it Resilient Experience Skills Training, focusing on developing skills that will help us to protect our sobriety in the case of addiction, and also help us to live more robust, resilient lives in the face of stressors. We're all very aware of stressors on an international, global level right now, as well as national, and I think we can use all the tips that we can get. So It's in that spirit that we're talking about resilience tonight, and specifically, I call it Resilient Experience Skills Training because it makes a really nice acronym. But having said that, we're really tied into developing resting brain as opposed to red alert brain, which is what our natural responses in the face of stress. And so we're trying to avert moving from stress into distress. One piece of that is looking at how our thoughts can fan the flames of stress and how we can very quickly build into a conflagration. So I want to talk with you some about that tonight and just invite any reflections you have. Doug, I'm happy to go where we go, but we're looking at the impact of our thinking. We spent a lot of time in the last weeks and even months looking at being able to calm our bodies, and now we're beginning to look at the nature of the relationship between emotion and thought, and particularly how certain kinds of thoughts can actually lead us into more distress, where others can actually calm the waters. And so I'd like to just kind of pick your brain and soul, my friend.
This one is so important because we as human beings, I know, has been a big issue for me too. For most of my life, we get so used to the process of thinking that we just proceed on autopilot. I would just not even realize the thoughts that were happening in my head all the time, and the problems that they can cause, the way they'd send me straight into that red alert brain that you mentioned. The practice of mindfulness, which we've talked a lot about in the context of relaxing the body, can be so important too as a first step in learning to really see what's going on under the hood and figure out what those automatic thoughts are. I know that until I really developed a daily habit of doing this and taking a look at what was going on there, I didn't even notice how much these different things were affecting me. And there's, of course, the dedicated practice period of learning the technique and then translating that into using it in the moment to learn what was going on. There's another component too, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point, maybe tonight, about what do we actually do with those thoughts once we've identified them and realized that they're happening there. And there's the first piece of recognizing them and the second piece of knowing what to do with them. And this all comes together to make a big difference in building resilience and maintaining sobriety. And I wanted to highlight too that I just love the topic of resilience and what an important skill that is, not just in recovery, but for life in general, and especially going into 2021, the world being the way it is. We need to be resilient humans in every area of our lives to get by in the world today.
Thank you for underscoring the kind of the overarching topic of resilience, and I really appreciate what you said preceding that. And I want to come back to that. Let me respond first to your comments about resilience. Different ways of defining it. I think of just being able to bounce back or bounce off of stress. Stress is integral to being human. There's no way that we can avoid stress, but we can develop capacities. And the way that you just framed it, the language you used, you said something to the effect of developing or building resilient skills. I think it's really hopeful to think, hey, there are actually skills that I might learn and develop by practice, and that they could actually become maybe even second nature, so that it's not something necessarily that you're either born with or not some kind of magical thing, that there are actually some skills. What I'd like to do, Doug, I feel inclined to do this, if you're willing, is I've spent time in the post that we're looking at today in terms of ways of analyzing, kind of slowing down the frames of the film to analyze thoughts that are oftentimes subtle. I'd like to look, if you're willing, because we have such limited time, at once I realize that I've got some thoughts that are not serving me, I'd love to compare notes, and I'd love to ask you, if you're willing, what do you do, Doug, when you come across something that you realize, this is going to send me down a rabbit hole that I can ill afford? I don't want to do this. What do you do?
Yeah. A couple years ago, I had a book recommended to me, and it's escaping my mind right now, but gosh, it was the best introduction in the world to cognitive behavioral therapy and what to do with these thoughts when you show up, once you notice them. And essentially it boils down to seeing what those thoughts are and then asking probing questions of each of them to challenge the truth, the validity of these thoughts, and learning a list of sort of fallacies. Catastrophizing is a big one, or crystal ball gazing, assuming the future. And there's a handful of others that all are fallacies we're prone to that send us into red alert mode that we can use to understand the faults of our thinking and bring us back to a place of more rational thought about it. When we realize that the habits of thought that we default to are not necessarily accurate at all and are doing us a lot of harm.
Yeah. I'm old enough, Doug, that when I started graduate school in the late 70s, cognitive behavior therapy was just beginning. In fact, it wasn't called that yet. And one of the founders that you will have read about, I'm sure that you're quite familiar with, is Albert Ellis, who developed an approach to therapy where he called what you're describing in terms of examining the fallacies of our thinking, he called it disputation. He called disputing the thought. And not long after that, Don Beck came about it. He was at the University of Pennsylvania. It was not Don Beck. That's so funny now. I'm conflating two different names right now. This is my tired brain. What was his first name? It wasn't Don Beck. Do you have it handy there? He cognitive behavioral therapy. What was his first name? It's going to come, you guys. As soon as you say it, I'm going to recognize it.
Yeah, I don't see it right now. But
he wrote the first book on cognitive therapy of depression. And I'm sorry I can't call up his name. What's happening is I know another Beck. We both know another Beck who wrote a book on spiral dynamics, and I've got their names going together right now. This is what I get for trying to be Mr. Smarty Pants after a long day of work. We'll call him Dr. Beck, Aaron Beck. I'm sorry, it just took me a minute. Aaron Beck followed on the heels, or kind of hand in hand with Albert Ellis, and developed the beginning seeds of what became cognitive behavioral therapy. I got to know and work with other people like Donald Meichenbaum. There are other people in the tradition of cognitive behavioral therapy. It really began to flourish in the 1980s. The seed beds are in the 1970s and then into the 1980s. And what's common across all of these is what you're talking about, is that they put a priority on looking at how our thoughts feed not only into body states, but also into emotional states, and that our anxieties and our depressions oftentimes can dissipate significantly if we can just examine those. I brought an example tonight, Your Honor. I just share it. It's not a big deal, but that's kind of the point. It should apply to anything, right? I swim every morning in the local community pool, as I've shared with you, Douglas, and also I think I've shared here before. And I get up very early. This morning I got up a little bit earlier than usual. I got up at 5 this morning. And this is the first time this has happened, but what I did is when I came back from swimming, I always tossed my swim trunks and my towel in the dryer to dry off because they're sopping wet. This morning I made the mistake of tossing in my swim goggles into the dryer, and this is what happened.
Yeah.
They're not made for the heat. They actually snapped, and where they broke is not reparable. And I came in after taking a shower to get my dry swim trunks and towel out of the dryer, and there was a very dry set of swim goggles. And one of the themes in my life that's arisen, Doug, and we've talked about this, is that I've grown up and adapted in my life by developing what I call unrelenting standards. I got that label from another cognitive behaviorist, Jeff Young. Okay. And that certainly applies to me. I took a test in one of his books, cognitive behavioral books, and that was one of the things that really stood out for me. And here's an example of it. Bob breaks his swim goggles. How hard am I going to be on myself for that?
Right.
And the truth is, I felt disappointed. It's a bummer. But what I was appreciative of, and it hasn't always been this case, and it's actually transforming as we speak, is while I was disappointed, I didn't go to the next level. And this is where Albert Ellis or cognitive disputation comes in. I didn't go into what kind of person would do that, you lousy so-and-so, all those kinds of automatic thoughts that might have followed and certainly would have accompanied something like this in the past. I felt disappointed, but it just stayed disappointed. It just stayed as disappointment. To use 12th step language, it stayed right-sized. It was right-sized. It was like a disappointment. And I even had a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek response, which was, it's amazing that it hasn't happened before, because I've done this almost every morning for 2 or 3 years running. I can't believe it's the first time that I've fried a set of swim goggles, because I'm usually kind of half awake in the morning. And so it's a minor example. Obviously, what it touches into is not at all minor for me personally in terms of these so-called unrelenting standards. And what I appreciate is that it's become fairly organic for me to look at a disappointment like this and much more quickly, almost automatically move into putting it in perspective. And so the perspective was, rather than berating myself for moving into some kind of shame capture, was feeling disappointed and thinking, okay, when do I have time today to order another set of goggles, because I need to replace these? And there wasn't even a lecture about make sure you don't do that again, because the fact is I'm getting up so flipping early, I probably will do that again and allow for that. So that's it in a nutshell. And I realize people might be listening to this and going, well, what's the big deal about goggles? Except that this theme could manifest with goggles or any relationship or any much bigger thing, and has for me. And it's as simple as that. So it's common sense in a way. I like what one psychologist says. He says it's actually uncommon sense. Yeah. Because common sense for most of us is irrationality.
Common nonsense.
Common nonsense, exactly. Yeah. So that's my example. And I'm curious to know if you have examples, or if you want to say more about this idea of kind of challenging the fallacies that arise for some of us, almost like knee-jerk reflexes. This one that I'm talking about is a lifelong issue, and I'll have some version of it to contend with, but it's lost its death grip on me in the last few years, for which I'm incredibly grateful.
Well, I think that beliefs like that and those unconscious habits are lifelong for most of us, and lead to some pretty ugly places. I so wish that I could remember the name of this book I was trying to think of. I listened to the audio version of it, and it was such a good exercise for me listening to him go through so many different examples of challenging these beliefs to relieve the depression that I was struggling with at the time. And hearing him give the examples over and over, working those along with him and applying those to my life at the time was tremendously helpful too, and really reinforced a lot of those concepts. I also, last fall, for the more tech-minded out there of you, I discovered an app that I was in the habit of using pretty regularly. It is an artificial intelligence conversation app called 𝗏𝗏bot, as in WOE 𝗏bot, like I'm sad to talk to the 𝗏bot, right? But what it did was exactly the process that we're talking here through, is have you capture your automatic thoughts and then break that down into smaller automatic sub-thoughts. Then for each of these, it would go through and say, okay, which cognitive distortions are you applying here? And if you're not able to name them, do you think it might be this? Yes or no? And let's review. And it was a really
good tool. Very good.
And that's the key to this, is they become second nature the more you practice. And so what I did is every time I started to feel distressed about something, would start beating myself up about this or worrying about that or whatever the case may be, I would pull out this app and run through the exercise. And after a while, it not only started to remove some of the more deep-seated things that were my personal habits of thought, but it made it easier to do on the fly in the future.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's a skill that we can get better and better at. I'll tell you what's coming up for me as you're talking is the book by David Burns, Feeling Good.
That's the one. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering if that's it. Just as you're talking about it, such a masterpiece. I just put that in the our chat here. Yeah, Feeling Good. I highly recommend it. The subtitle of it is The Nude Mood Therapy, and what he's talking about is that we can change these overarching umbrella moods of depression or anxiety, you name it, that we can actually do something about, that we're not held captive by them. I love that you're pointing this out. Yeah, as you were talking further, I thought that sounds like David Burns to me. Yeah. Wonderful resource. And it's a resource that professionals use as well as completely, as you know, completely accessible to the layperson. So it's wonderful. So one of the things about cognitive behavioral therapy, it doesn't involve understanding complicated concepts from developmental psychology or being a statistician or being a researcher. You can read this and you can begin applying it immediately because it's so it's tapping into universals. We all get caught in these cognitive distortions, and what can we do to get ourselves free? Yeah.
Yeah, and you realize you're in red alert mode, and then start to ask the right questions and challenge those beliefs, and really helps. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Doug and I were talking before tonight's live event that we decided we did this on purpose, not really, that I came as red alert brain.
Yep.
The next time that you see me, I hope to be in Doug's resting brain. For whatever reason, the filter on this particular application makes my face really red. And what's funny is I'm in online other application video rooms all day long, and I actually look pale. I don't know what it's about, but in this one. So I want you guys to know this is not a sunburn, and this is actually not red alert. This is a function of this, and I think Doug has helped me with what's going to fix this the next time. But what he's talking about in terms of red alert brain is that when we have a natural negativity bias in our brains, you can understand why we have these distortions, because they serve at some kind of really primitive level. The problem is they get overgeneralized, and pretty soon everything is a snake. Everything is to be avoided. Everything is dangerous. My inadvertently sticking my swimming goggles in the dryer becomes a federal disaster, and so it's like putting things in perspective is what we learn, and so we are able to still hang on to our fight or flight reactions, but to hopefully tamp them down so that they're not just running our lives. And I really do think a red alert brain is getting to where it's where the limbic system or the emotional center of the brain is just kind of stuck on. And so what we're doing is we're bringing cognitive frontal cortex resources to bear. As one supervisor of mine puts it, it's beginning to utilize some brakes where if the fight or flight system represents the accelerator inside of our bodies and brains, what it would be like to do judiciously, mindfully, be able intentionally to choose for applying the brakes from time to time. And I think what we're talking about with cognitive behavioral therapy fully applies our frontal lobe resources to helping calm down that red alert brain.
That's a really nice analogy too, because these are tools that you use in the moment when you need them. Of course, there's a whole deeper level of work that can be done in analyzing where these tendencies and where these beliefs came from too, and whose voice am I hearing and how has this affected me, and doing all that work can be valuable and important, but it doesn't necessarily help get you out of red alert brain in the moment. And we need something like the cognitive behavioral therapy and or identifying those beliefs through mindfulness in the first place to immediately pull us back into a place where we're not going to make decisions that lead us down a bad course of action to relapse or other destructive behaviors.
Yeah, it's really well said. I appreciate you naming this, Doug. You remind me of a story. This is from about 30 years ago. I had a client come in my office. This is years ago, but I can still picture it. Client came in my office. This is the only time this ever happened. He came in with a book. It was a book on the cognitive behavioral therapy for a specific form of anxiety. And he brought in the book, and he actually slapped it down on the table right in the office. And it was this table between us. It was like a glass table. I can still picture it. He looked at me and he said, I'm here to work on this particular anxiety, and I want to use this model. In fact, I want to use this book. Can you help me? I'd never had anybody be so specific like that, so kind of prescriptive. I paused for a second and I said, I could help you with that. I've actually taught cognitive behavioral therapy at a graduate level. I could probably do that. But I told him, I said, the truth is that most of my work is more of the second category, Doug, of what you just said. Mm-hmm. Most of the work that I do is more insight-oriented therapy, looking at developmental issues and trying to unpack those and change our lives at kind of this more deep structural level. I think there's a great importance in that, but I think in order to do that work, just what you just said, that needs to be cleared out. And so I want to recommend that you see my friend Marty. Marty and I had gone through graduate school together. Marty was an expert in the cognitive behavioral therapy of anxiety. He himself had struggled with anxiety, had applied it. I knew that he knew it inside out. Why would I do something that was kind of like left-handed for me when this was Marty's dominant hand? It was his right hand. So I sent this guy to go see Marty. And he did. Marty said, thank you for the referral, Bob. And they did their work. And it was about 6 months later, I got a phone call back from the original client. And he said, I'd like to come back and see you now. He says, I have some dreams and I want to work on my dreams. Yeah. And I thought, how perfect is that? There's always been a model for me of how it ought to be. Let me work on what it is that I'm skilled at doing. And if somebody's better than I, let's say it's you, let me refer them to you. And let's there's lots of ways of meeting people's needs. It takes a village, right? So I feel like what you just said is really true, is that cognitive behavioral therapy, some people will criticize it because maybe it is so common sense, or maybe it doesn't go deep enough. And I think it's up to the individual. You and I both value spiritual development. Cognitive behavioral therapy makes no claims about enhancing spiritual development. I do think what it can do is clear out the way for spiritual development, particularly if I've got things that are standing as obstructions to that. And so why wouldn't I want to clear out the underbrush so that I can get to the tree that really matters to me, which might be the Bodhi tree? So,
right. Yeah, it's not a case of either or. They complement and enhance one another.
Yeah. So I appreciate you naming that. Having said that, then we're not talking about an end-all and be-all with anything here at Vitality Project. It's like, let's bring in all resources imaginable. One of the things, Doug, that you and I have talked about as both being adherents of integral approaches to recovery, integral approaches to living, is that, and we learned this in conversations with our mutual friend, John Dupuis, is that at the very least, can we look at what we can do to calm and address our bodies? What can we do to address the mental, emotional factors? What can we do to cultivate our spirituality? Because you and I are both artists and musicians at heart, I also include what can we do to cultivate our creative self-expression? I think of that as the soul. That's my moniker for that. So body, mind, spirit, soul. And the only other thing I'd include in there would be shadow. Which is not insignificant, but that's all the stuff that we don't see. And I think it can be really helpful to have a spiritual guide or counselor or a psychotherapist or a good coach to help us be able to spot our shadow. And that covers a lot of it. And you know as well as I that there's not going to be a single panacea for all 5 of those dimensions of our being. And those are just 5. That's just 5. They're 5 that matter, but that's not all of who we are. We're not reducible to any one of those, nor all of those. There's more to us than that. So anyway, I appreciate very much what you're saying.
Yep. All of those. And then we bring in the relational component, societal component. It just never stops. Just the other day was having a conversation with somebody about the book Integral Life Practice and rereading and doing that. It's been so valuable to me to work on all of those things together because
I'm going to write it down here. I'm going to write it down here in our chat. Thank you for mentioning that. I'm also going to write John's book. if anybody is watching this tonight or hears it, watches this later, the resource is written by 𝗬𝗂𝗿 et al. Is Integral Life Practice. It's a Bible of developing practices that support us across all of the realms. By the way, thank you for throwing in relationship. That's my bad. And in the context of what's going on right now, societally, culturally, all of that, we are complex beings situated in multiple kind of nested, I don't know, I think of sometimes like nested bowls in a sense. You just keep taking it out there in terms of what represents Doug and what represents Bob. Integral Recovery is written by our friend John Dupuis, and both of these books, Integral Life Practice, Integral Recovery, really are talking about a truly holistic approach to life. And I like the way that 𝗬𝗂𝗿 puts it, with a map.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Doug, anything else? We're going to wind down in just a minute, but I'd like to give the parting shot to you if you'd like to share anything else that stands on your mind.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and address this tonight. I think it reminded me of that app, the 𝗬𝗏 that I talked about, which I need to go play with again because it was such a valuable resource. And this is one of those things too that is easy to learn, but important to practice and keep the skill sharp, as it were, because it has served so well. So I'm very highly optimistic that anyone listening to this who goes and explores some of these things will have a good experience and discover some helpful things.
I just had something click, Doug, listening to you right now, talking about practice and 𝗬𝗏. I find it ironic and even in some ways humorous is that my experience with the melted swim goggles was on the heel of my swimming and on the heels of my quiet time this morning, which you and I both value, cultivating our interior resources. And my swimming is part of that. It's exercise for me, but as you know, and we've talked about it some here, it's also a time in which I practice forgiveness practice and gratitude practice. It was on the heels of that, and I don't think that they're unrelated. My response to the goggles was itself cultivated by my swimming with what earlier were intact goggles.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for that. Maybe the next time we show up, I'll just wear my new goggles when they come.
And remember, they're already broken.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Doug. Thanks for your presence. I love where we go. It's a joy being with you, Doug. Thank you. I wish you have a good evening. I put your name in the post. If anybody wants further contact with you, they can reach out to me for sure, and I'll put them in contact with you. Blessings to you, dear friends. Take care. Have a good evening, Doug. Bye-bye. Good night. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.